Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our SmartHER series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Hey everybody, great to see you. Welcome to this week's Debrief, one of our favorite times of the week where we get to take a deep breath when it comes to the news and dig a little deeper on some of these topics that are coming at you really rapid fire throughout the week. As you know, SmartHER News is all about quick, concise, nonpartisan information, but this is our chance to slow down a little bit, which I love to do with you and I really appreciate. So this week's news certainly has been heavy. We've had a lot of really heavy stories. I think it's not going too far to describe some of these stories as extraordinarily dark. These have been heavy stories. We're really talking about good and evil. We started this week's news cycle with the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. We're going to spend a little time on that topic. So just a word to the wise, we're going to go for it today. We're going to actually go deep into some of these topics that are not only on the front pages, but something that we're likely talking about in our households on a regular basis. And so I was trying to figure out how to frame our conversation this week because of the content of the news. And I started to look at the different stories that are out there. And I like to do that just every once in a while, almost like a collage. I think about the stories all in front of us and think, well, how do they work together? Not necessarily directly connected. We don't want to directly connect something as a cause and effect, but how can we look at these stories together in a way that helps our brain hold them at the same time so that we could kind of think about, well, how can we look at these stories a little bit different, a little bit smarter, if you will? See how that works? And I started to look at these different stories that we were covering, and I always like to pick, well, what are the most important things if you only have 30 seconds to 3 minutes every day? Like, what are the stories that you should just be aware of that are happening? And that's sort of how we're choosing our quick quotes or the different topics that we're diving deep on. And as I looked at this collage in front of me, I thought, you know what? What are we doing with all of our news stories? We're doing regular threat assessments. Like, why is the news so heavy? Why does it feel difficult to trudge through some of these topics on a regular basis? It's not just the topics themselves. Is that over the last several years, one of the things we've been required to do when we're confronting news stories are threat assessments. What is the threat to me? What is the threat to my community? What's the threat to my country? And that takes a lot of energy. That's something that we're probably doing on a regular basis, just trying to keep our kids safe when they're crossing the street, let alone with all the different news stories, whether it's about the pandemic or the economy. And I'm going to show you what I mean in just a moment, because I have a list of the stories that we're dealing with this week, and you can see how they could be sort of categorized as threat assessments. What are the threats of these stories? Why are we covering them? Well, they could threaten you in some way, whether it's economically, national security, or otherwise. And as I was stumbling kind of through this, working through this topic for you today, and I have my research, I have quite a few. This is a good sign of what the debrief is going to look like when I have a lot of notes. And what's interesting is I usually have my notes in front of me and then I just like to forget them because I just want to talk to you like a normal person and not be reading. But I'm going to read quite a bit from one particular report. And we'll talk about that. That's on mass shootings. But as I was looking through this and I was getting prepared right at the end, right before I started to record this, I stumbled again on something important, and that is both leading liberal figures in America and leading conservative figures in America agree on one thing. They are both saying to you that we are at a dangerous point in this country. My question for you is, do you feel that way? And I'm going to ask you that now, and then I'm going to ask you at the end. And I'm curious your thoughts on that. The president talked about this week. In fact, he talked about this in Buffalo, New York, when he was there speaking to the families most impacted by this terrible crime, this murder that took place on Saturday. He said, the American experiment in democracy is in danger like it hasn't been in my lifetime. This is the president of the United States. And one of the ways that he was framing this is that he was talking about the threat of racism in America, violence and racism, rhetoric that was dangerous online. This was all part of his speech. So just by chance, I thought, well, let me look up and see what a leading conservative voice is saying. What are leading conservative politicians saying this week about America? And if you look through different social media profiles of high-ranking Republicans, you can see that some of the picture that they're painting is that America is in danger because of President Biden's policies. I actually looked at the transcript from Tucker Carlson's show. Tucker Carlson is a leading conservative figure, obviously is one of the biggest television shows in America right now. So what was he talking about last night? Was he framing it this way? And in some ways he was. He was talking about why America is in danger because of President Biden's policies, and that we could be heading towards being more like Venezuela, a nation that's in complete poverty and disaster. The way that he was framing this argument is also because of racism. He was saying the Biden administration's focus on racism was distracting the whole of government away from some of the issues that matter. So in a strange way, you have these two diametrically opposed figures. One's the president, one's a television host. They're not necessarily, I'm not necessarily trying to equate them on the same platform, but leading voices that are getting a lot of attention in America, clearly, and worldwide. And in a lot of ways, they're painting the same picture. The American experiment is under threat. So my question for you today is that true? So let's go through some of the stories this week. I'm going to give you a couple headlines. These are good to know just in general, some things that are happening, stories we're going to watch moving ahead, but also things that have happened this week. And we're going to put them in the category of threat assessments. What sort of threat does this pose us? And we're going to look through that sort of lens. I'm not going to make a judgment of what the threat is, but I'm just going to show you, well, you could kind of put this in this category. So let's start with the threat of those from the outside. That could be a very broad category. In fact, we saw a lot of different stories regarding that this week. We saw the first congressional hearing in 50 years on UFOs. They're not using that term anymore. But the question about what's out there, what sort of threat could be out there, whether it's from our adversaries or an unknown origin, these unidentified aerial phenomenons that we don't know exactly what they are. This is one of the things that Congress is focusing on this week, a threat from the outside. You could talk about a threat from outside of our borders when we look at immigration. We got some new immigration numbers just today. And these immigration numbers, we just got this immigration numbers, I should say, over the last 24, 48 hours. And what these numbers are showing us, these are the monthly report that we get on the U.S. southern border that tells us, well, how many people have attempted to come into the country illegally. Perhaps they're seeking asylum. We know that there's a lot of nuances to that. We're seeing the highest number that we've ever seen in modern data collection just last month alone. So we're seeing more than 200,000 people that were encountered at the U.S. southern border by law enforcement. So that's something that, again, there's different threat assessments about. Some people think that's a threat to America. Other people think that's not. And so that's another example of a threat from the outside. The president is going to be traveling this week. He's going to be doing this because of a question about a threat from an outsider as well. The focus is going to be on China. The president is starting his first trip to Asia, his first presidential trip to Asia today, which is Thursday. He's going to be overseas for the next several days, just under a week. And one of the reasons he's doing that is because he's going to be meeting with our allies because of China. We're going to be watching North Korea very closely. Again, the threat from the outside. Because we know North Korea is a state sponsor of terror. We know that they've been doing different missile tests. And we're going to be watching to see, well, what are the dynamics at play? So the president's going to be abroad, and that's important to know. So those are the threats from the outside. We also saw threats from Mother Nature this week. We're seeing the largest wildfire in the history of New Mexico, burning for the last several weeks. Big news item, didn't get a lot of national attention until really the last week. And in fact, it happened on the same week we're getting a report that more and more Americans are going to be confronting the threat of natural disasters in the way of wildfires over the next several decades. A new study was out about that. The Washington Post had a particular piece on that. We'll have that linked on our website. We also have the threat, when we're thinking about threats, we have the threat of adversaries. The most obvious, of course, being we've been looking at Russia and what's happening in Ukraine. We see two European nations looking to join NATO, the largest military alliance that exists, the peacetime military alliance that exists. And we're watching to see, well, who is going to join forces to confront a common threat? But in addition to that as well, we also saw sort of a quiet announcement that U.S. troops are going to go back to Somalia. The Trump administration withdrew some of these troops from Somalia. We had a footprint of several hundred there on a regular basis. President Trump didn't think that's where they needed to be. He was trying to wind down, quote unquote, forever wars. This is something that the Biden administration and President Biden has also talked about. There's a commonality between the two, but the threat of al-Shabaab, a large al-Qaeda branch in Africa continues to grow. And the White House made the assessment, no, that U.S. troops have to go back to Somalia to help support the government there, but also support our counterterrorism efforts. So that might be a news item that was easy to miss. What about the threat of economic disaster, financial threat? That's something that affects all of us. We're always looking at the economy. One of the things we saw this week is one of the worst performances in the stock market in more than 2 years. The Dow Jones dropped more than 1,000 points, on concerns about what's happening in the economy. So there's another threat that's being required when you see a headline like that. Well, what's that threat to me? What does that mean to me? We know that a stock market trading day in and of itself is not a story, but that's pretty significant because, again, it was one of the worst trading days that we've seen in a few years' time. So why is that happening? So you can see as we list all these stories, it can, these are not bright and sunshiny stories. These are all stories that are requiring of us, well, what is the threat to me, to my livelihood, to my safety here at home, the future of my children? And this is where our news is right now. And this is something that you've had to do in addition over the last several years as you tried to navigate the pandemic. So when you feel exhausted by the news, this is one of the reasons why. If we look at things only through this lens, well, what we can do in journalism is to provide more context to some of these stories so that we can understand the nuances in them and perhaps have more enriched conversations, more informed conversations. The more information I know about a topic, the more in control I feel. I don't know if you guys feel that same way. Doesn't mean that I have mastery of the topic or I'm not afraid of an outside threat, whatever that is. But if I'm able to organize it in my brain so it's not bouncing around in such a chaotic way, I find that helpful. So that's one of the things I want to do for us today, or something that I did this week looking through the news that I want to share with you. That was helpful to me. And so what we're going to pause on here is the threat of mass shootings. We have obviously witnessed over the last several years, several mass shootings, all a little bit different, but all have some commonalities. And we're going to talk about what those commonalities are, because I think you're going to find them very interesting. So obviously, one of the big stories is the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. We know that today, the gunman in this crime will appear in court. One of the, I don't want to say kind of the, I'm taking some liberty here calling him the gunman. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty. There's no real dispute that he's not the gunman in this particular case. And because of the nature of this crime, because of the situation, I think calling him an alleged shooter probably isn't appropriate, right? He's facing allegations, but calling him alleged is probably not appropriate either. So I'm going to follow the international news wires or calling him the gunman. So we're going to call him the gunman as well. So the gunman will be appearing in court today in Buffalo. And this is going to be part of the process of moving him towards trial. I thought there were some interesting things that came out of the district attorney in the area, because one of the questions that the district attorney has had to face is isn't this an open and shut case? Isn't it very clear what happened here? This man walked into a supermarket. He opened fire at innocent people. He killed 10 of them. It clearly appears racially targeted because most of his victims were Black, and the subsequent announcements made by law enforcement and those in positions of power have made this very explicit. So what's the conflict here? Why isn't this just open and shut? And so I thought this was an interesting comment from the district attorney, John Flynn. He said this, he said, emotions are high. I understand the rawness of this matter. However, I do not operate in a court of public opinion. I operate in a court of law, and this defendant is innocent until proven guilty. So that's the district attorney, and we'll be watching the next steps as the charges all come together. Yes, this person is facing first-degree murder charges, but there's a process until we get to trial, and we're going to be watching that process very closely. The Buffalo Police Commissioner, and here's one of the reasons why. Obviously, you've heard a lot about what apparently this person posted online before this event. And over the last several days, I have searched to try to see, could I find it? Sometimes you can find the sources that law enforcement is talking about, whether it's a document that's explaining the crime, the motivation, a diary. We've heard that a diary has also been found. In fact, I reached out to a think tank that talked to the New York Post about this diary. We linked to that article on our website because I wanted to confirm that they actually saw the diary. And they would not confirm it. I asked for an interview. They wouldn't do an interview. So I'm working on it. I want to see the primary source. We want to see exactly what was said, because right now we're working off the categorization of it. And there's nothing for us to believe the characterization is not accurate. We've heard the police commissioner himself talk about how this is a racist attack. However, here's what else the police commissioner is now saying as well, that investigators are working to obtain, verify, and review his online postings. Which makes me wonder, well, who has them? The FBI has them. What do we know about them? So clearly there is a lot to collect. Again, nothing is suggesting that what we've heard so far isn't accurate, isn't true. But we know that court cases involve a lot of evidence. And so I think it's also important to note that although people are referencing this, clearly law enforcement is still collecting it and trying to also verify it themselves. So what I wanted to get a better understanding of is the threat of mass shootings. One of the difficult things as a journalist is that when it comes to a lot of crime, here's a big thing just to know, is that federal databases are often dependent upon local reporting. Sometimes local reporting happens, sometimes it doesn't. Does the city of San Francisco report to the federal government all the crimes that the city of San Francisco has confronted? Likely big cities do. Smaller cities may not even have the resources to do that. So sometimes when we're looking at crimes in America and we're turning to the federal government for that database, we have to know the limitations of the database. We also know that the data sometimes is delayed. We know all data is delayed, it's all backwards looking. So for mass shootings in particular, when mass shootings have different definitions, which I'll talk about in just a moment, then it can be difficult to give context to what we're seeing when someone says this is a mass shooting. What happened in Buffalo, New York would be categorized as a mass shooting. It's when 4 or more people have been shot and killed. That doesn't include the shooter. So these are victims. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, there was a mass shooting in Chicago. There was a mass shooting in another area. We're not paying attention to that because, it's inner city crime. That may be true for 2 reasons. One, sometimes people call a mass shooting an event when people are injured, 4 or more people are injured, not necessarily killed. And sometimes a lot of databases will exclude any mass shootings that happen when another crime is taking place. So let's say there's a robbery that goes wrong, a bank robbery, and 6 people are killed. It may not be called a mass shooting event because the mass shooting wasn't the central crime, it was the robbery. If the central crime was gang violence, and many other people were shot, injured, or killed around this, that may not be a mass shooting. And it's certainly when it comes to the federal database, when we're talking about mass shootings in particular, we're talking about events where the shooting itself is the crime. And so that's a really important discrepancy, I think, just to be aware of, because often you'll hear that debate in public, right? Well, why are we paying attention to these mass shootings and not others? Well, it depends on what data you're looking at. So let me talk to you about what I found. I was trying very, very hard to get, well, what does the research tell us? And I stumbled upon a report from the National Institute of Justice. This was just released in early February. So the timing of it is remarkable considering what we're dealing with in this news cycle, which is the mass shooting. And what they did in this particular report is they looked at mass shootings in America defined by 4 or more people killed in a single incident going back to the 1960s. Overall, it looks like they looked at just over 160 mass shootings in that period. And so what I want to work through with you is, because you hear a lot of debate about this particular topic, whether we're talking about mental health, gun laws, racism, we're talking about any of these topics that could be connected to Buffalo. I also want to talk to you about, well, what does the data show us about mass shootings in general? How does this fit or doesn't fit with what the historical context is? So the report starts off with this. Persons who committed public mass shootings in the U.S. over the last half century were commonly troubled by personal trauma before their shooting incidents, nearly always in a state of crisis at the time, and in most cases engaged in leaking their plans before opening fire. The report goes on to explain all of these different variables. One of the things you've likely heard over the last week or so is that we have seen mass shootings increase in America. But what does that mean? If I were to ask you, how many mass shootings do you think have taken place in America over the last 50 years? Would you estimate in the dozens, hundreds, thousands? What would be your estimate? This report says that they're looking at 167 mass shootings over that 50-year period. One of the ways the researchers did this research is not just looking through news reports or police reports, going back in history, trying to figure out what would be a mass shooting and what wouldn't. They actually interviewed people in prison that were convicted of mass shootings, which I thought was a really interesting part of their research. So when we talk about the increase in mass shootings, what are we talking about? This is the statistics: 167 mass shootings in the last 50 years. About half of them have taken place in the last 20 years. More than 30% have taken place in the last 10 or 12 years. So they have increased in frequency. They've also increased in deadliness in the most recent incidents of shootings. So when you look at the most deadly mass shootings, they occurred between 1999 and 2019. And the death toll, when you look at the average death toll, which I know is kind of a morbid statistic, it has gone up as we have moved into a later date, according to the research. So that's why we're hearing that about why it's increased. What is a commonality between those that perpetuate mass shootings? Who are they? What do we need to know most about them? One of the things that they found, the researchers, that suicide happened to be a very common thread, that in general, individuals wanted to commit suicide prior to the actual event. And sometimes during the event, when we're talking about younger kids, we're talking about teenagers in school specifically, 90% have been found suicidal. College and university students engage in mass shooting suicide 100% of the time. So for the younger group, suicide is definitely something that's a common thread. In general, it is a common thread through all mass shootings. However, this idea of mental illness and being in crisis, the researchers say, is complicated and not clear-cut. They say psychosis played a minor role in nearly 1/3 of the cases, a primary role in about 10%. So this idea that mental illness is the main driver doesn't explain why these individuals took that step, according to the research as they know it. Nearly half of the individuals who committed these crimes made their plans known in advance. This is one of the reasons why when this shooting first broke on the news, I always want to watch what the police are saying about the shooter. It has been very consistent in most of these cases that this has been telegraphed, that the crime has been telegraphed in some way. At that point, we didn't necessarily know that the event had been live streamed in part, but that someone announces that they're going to be doing this, or they talk about it weeks in advance, and that it's very clear that this is an intention, this is a commonality in a lot of crimes, unfortunately, that we see that are disastrous. Here's another kind of interesting fact from the report, because gun control, gun laws has been a major conversation piece. What kind of weapons do individuals use in mass shootings? If I were to ask you that, what would it be? What image comes to mind? We know that this individual in Buffalo used a rifle, semi-automatic rifle. But in most cases, almost 80% of cases, a handgun is used, a pistol, not necessarily a rifle. This particular document says assault rifle. I'm not going to be using that term. More appropriate would be a semi-automatic rifle. That's if you went into a store, if you're looking at rifles, that would be more of the term that is used. And in most cases, the guns that were used in these crimes were actually legally obtained. What about demographics? Who actually commits these crimes? The majority of people are white, 20% are Black, 8% Latino, Asians 6%, Middle Eastern and Native American kind of round out as well. So these are just statistics just to be aware of as we're looking through what we learn about Buffalo. That's really the question of, well, what is this incident parallel in the past that gives us an idea of how to attack the problem of mass shootings? And what is our threat assessment of mass shootings? One of the things that this report says, and I'm going to read this to you. I said this earlier this week, and some of you had issue with it. I just wanted you to know where exactly it came from. One of the things that the researchers say is that there's some limitation to gathering data. They said that media outlets have their own biases in terms of coverage of mass shootings. Generally, certain categories of mass shootings tend to attract the most coverage. They include bias in favor of mass shootings related to schools, military bases, what they're calling assault rifles, higher body counts of younger victims, clustered other shootings. So they're saying that the media really focuses on these crimes. And we know that to be the case, don't we? This is the final line of their report. The researchers cautioned readers to interpret mass shooting trends over time with caution in light of the fact that mass shootings are extreme and rare events. Extreme and rare events. So rare events, you could say, well, that doesn't really matter, does it? Because if you're a victim of one of these events, it doesn't matter how rare it is. We don't want these events to take place. In the context of other shootings that happen in America, that's what the researchers are talking about. These events of mass shootings are rare events, but they get disproportionate amount of media coverage. So let's just sort of wrap this all up together. This idea of what threatens us as individuals, what threatens our community, what threatens our country is a consistent theme really in our news cycle. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this report and some of the data that's out there is to equip you with some information when you're having conversations about threat assessments. A lot of our disagreements are when someone thinks that there's a threat to them and their community and others people don't consider it as much of a threat. Those are a lot of our disagreements in politics. There are a lot of disagreements amongst friends. This story in Buffalo, New York has also brought up this idea of existential threats. What is an existential threat to an individual? What threatens their ability to exist, but they're also their ability to live their most free life? You could put war in that category, nuclear war in that category. You put all sorts of things, but you could also reference racism in that category. The existential threat of racism, that's something that the president talked a lot about as being a major issue for America. And then you have a different picture of it coming from others that are saying our focus on it is actually what's threatening to America. One of the challenges I faced in SmartHER News is to constantly go back to what journalism is supposed to be. And I want to return to the basics. I want you to have a place to go for the who, what, where, when, how, and why. One of the questions I often get is, well, why isn't SmartHER News more forward-leaning in this conversation about racism? Why aren't you coming out and denouncing these crimes? Why aren't you a stronger voice on this particular issue? And although these issues that we cover are extremely emotional and extremely important, my job isn't to weigh in on them. And I think it is interesting, just as a point of observation, that when it comes to the topic of racism, I get that question a lot. When it comes to other topics, I don't get it quite as much. Let's say women's rights, for example, or child abuse. I was thinking about this, some of the dark stories that we've covered over the years, I've covered in my career. One of the darkest stories I've ever covered had to do with a man by the name of Jerry Sandusky. He was a child abuser and used his position and power as part of a football team to prey on young boys. And he was a predator, as defined as one could be. He was convicted. He's been found guilty. But one of the things I had to do is I had to research the evidence against him. And I remember going through that evidence. And again, everyone's innocent until proven guilty. But when you read these stories, the nightmares that could come from them, I don't think I've ever read anything like it. It was so dark and so heavy and so terrible. And yet every day I would have to get up on the news and we'd have to talk about the allegations and you'd have to talk about his denial. And that's one of the things that's required of you as a journalist, is to make sure that you can really understand the issues, then step back and say to your audience, here's a couple different sides of this particular story. And you step back and you let your audience make up your own mind. In that particular case, no one, even though it was so clear, it was so clear, good and evil. No one ever asked me, well, why are you not denouncing child abuse? Why aren't you denouncing exploitation? Why are you not being stronger on that particular topic? That's just not my role. My role isn't to weigh in on that particular topic, no matter how much passion I feel about it, how much passion I feel about any of these topics. National security, how safe you are, how safe your kids are, how we feel about women's rights in America, how we feel about the voting rights, any of these major issues that are very emotional. I want you to know that I recognize how emotional and how important they are. But my job isn't to make big proclamations about any of these topics, no matter how I want to sometimes. So I'll return, as you guys have heard this long list. It's a laundry list of what could be threats that face the country, whether it's the threat of outsiders, natural disasters, adversaries, financial, security issues like mass shootings, existential threats like racism. What do you think about where we are in America right now? Is the American experiment in democracy in danger like it's never been in danger before? I'm curious your thoughts on that. I'm anxious to hear from you. And I'm going to try, as we've done this once, so we've had our checklist of threat assessments. I want us to always understand why a story matters. Sometimes that has to do with threats to us or our families, our safety, our happiness. But we also want to add in the research and the different contexts that helps us to have more enriching conversations. So I'm going to be doubling down on that over the next several weeks for sure. Next week, we're not going to have our typical debrief. We're going into Memorial Day weekend. Memorial Day is one of those fascinating holidays in American history where we have a specific story and then we have several others that people say is really the story about Memorial Day. Memorial Day is a special holiday for my family. I'll talk to you a little bit about that next week, and we'll cover a couple of the different historical stories to know about Memorial Day. So when you're enjoying that time with your family and friends, we remember those that make the ultimate sacrifice so that we can have these sort of conversations and entertain this question about the future of America. So that's coming up. Questions and comments, let me know. Always more on smarternews.com. And thank you so much for your support. I'll see you with more on Smarter News.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing Smarter.